So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some qualitative research methods that besides field research. And so intensive interviewing is one of those. So this is more along the lines of qualitative, because in quantitative you can have interviewing, but it would be very structured, and here's the questions you're going to be asking and here are the possible responses, or you sort of would measure the responses later. But intensive interviewing is typically more of a qualitative because it's open-ended questions. It's semi-structured format at best. You have a couple of things that you want to sort of make sure to touch on, but a lot of it is just let them go where they want to go, and sort of if they want to talk about something, let them talk about it. And it's important. If it's important to them, it's important to you. So it's very much less structured compared to a more quantitative type of interviewing technique. So the goal of intensive interviewing then is to get this in-depth information. You want that rich, deep, textual information. And so you want to actively probe for understanding and also intended meanings as the interviewer. So you want to make sure that you understand the comments that were made and you understand them the way that they were intended. So ask clarifying questions, follow-up questions, things like that. It's also good to make sure that you and the subject are talking about the same thing and defining concepts and terms the same way. So there's a very good example that I remember reading about that where there was an interview that was being conducted with this girl who was part of a gang, and the interviewer was getting confused because she was saying some things about how she was using pot, but then later they would ask about marijuana and she said no. And so it was, the idea is that the girl didn't realize that pot and marijuana were the same thing. And so that was sort of an understanding sort of differential that happened there, that the interviewer had to sort of figure out, okay, no, wait, we are not talking about the same thing. This girl doesn't realize that when I'm talking about pot, I mean marijuana, and that marijuana is pot, and these are the same thing. So sometimes it's you, as the interviewer, you have to sort of actively just gauge to make sure that this is what you're actually, this is what I'm talking about, this is what you're talking about. Make sure that you and the interviewee are on the same page. Then you want to make sure you interview until you hit that saturation point. And this means that this is the point when either new interviews with different people or new questions within the same interview are not yielding any additional information. So the saturation point is the point at which you've learned everything you can via this method and from this group, and so you basically can't, there's no point in continuing on, and so you're saturated with information is essentially the saturation point. And so you're not, so maybe you're conducting another interview and you're like, I'm getting all the same information that I've already gotten from everybody else. So once you're starting to realize that, and there's that pattern, then you're like, okay, I've hit my saturation point. I've basically gotten all the information I'm going to get. Tape recorders or sort of some kind of recording devices can be used if it won't affect the responses. Tape recorders are commonly used, and it's actually, most researchers feel like recording doesn't actually inhibit most interviewees, even though you might think it might. Typically it doesn't, and they don't really care as long as they know that they're being interviewed or they're being recorded during their interview. Most people typically don't care. Even if it's like criminals you're talking to, it's not usually an inhibiting thing. But if you have a respondent who is, for some reason, very concerned about the fact that they're being recorded, maybe it's because they have a public image they need to maintain, then they may speak for the recorder, which won't be the same as if they're just speaking to you candidly. So you have to kind of gauge that and see if it is going to be something that's going to negatively affect your interview or not. Focus groups are sort of another type of qualitative technique. And this is where you have groups of individuals that are interviewed, again, typically using open-ended questions, and it's about facilitating a discussion. And so typically it's about 7 to 10 people is kind of a good number for a focus group, because you want enough people that it's going to facilitate a discussion, but you don't want too many people so that some people are basically either too shy to speak because the group is too big, or they don't get a chance to speak because there's just not enough room for them to speak. So about 7 to 10 people is typically a good number, and you want to make sure that you're getting information from everybody. Everybody is contributing. So the groups for focus groups are typically chosen to be somewhat homogeneous, in the sense that you want them to be similar or like-minded for important things, because this will reduce their inhibitions for discussing, for one thing. So they'll feel better talking about something if they know that other people in the group feel a similar way. And so then that'll make it so people, it's not going to be combative, it's just going to be a discussion. And so those are typically more useful than having a group of a bunch of different people with totally different belief systems and thought processes, and then they're just going to end up arguing. And that's not what you want a focus group for. So sometimes it means you're going to have multiple focus groups. Like, for example, let's have a focus group that's primarily Democrats and a focus group that's primarily Republicans. That would be a very common thing to do, because you want to get the whole picture, but you don't want it to just be a fight. So typically it's better to have groups that are like-minded so that they can just have a good conversation about whatever the topic is. And focus groups are often used sort of before a more in-depth research study is conducted, or sort of a way to gather new information, because it's sort of we don't really know how this group feels about this. Like focus groups are used a lot in like marketing and things like that to say, oh, well, how do young people feel about this new product or something like that. So that's kind of more commonly where it's used, but it's really anywhere where you're trying to gather information enough to then develop a more distinct or sort of guided research study. So focus groups are often sort of let's see where we need to start here, and let's just get people's responses or reactions to things. So when we are analyzing any type of qualitative data, there are a few stages that you kind of need to go through. So the first stage is that you've got your documentation and your data collection. That's kind of what happens while you're gathering your data. But you have to make sure that you are actually, so if you're doing field notes, let's say, then you are actually you're getting complete data collection there. So you are doing your complete notes. You're not just basing things on jottings that you then try to go figure out what you were talking about like months or years later. So you want to make sure you have that clear documentation and data collection. You then want to take all this, you're going to have all this metadata, all this notes and piles of notes and things like that, and you're going to put it all together and you're going to organize it into some kind of concepts. So multiple concepts. So there'll be, this is what everybody said about like this thing, and everybody said about this thing, and everybody said about this thing. So maybe if you're talking to say elite level escorts, then here's what here's the concept about how safe they feel, and here's what they said about the money they make, and here's what they said about their self-image. And so you sort of organize what everybody said, which is everybody is going to say something a little bit different, and so then you kind of organize it into boxes essentially. So then you start to make connections between concepts, and maybe some of this will be comparing different groups. And so maybe you had interviews with high-level escorts and then street-level prostitutes, and maybe you sort of can make some connections that the high-level elite escorts, they make more money, and so that positively affects their self-esteem, whereas the street-level prostitutes are not making very much money and they have lower self-esteem. So maybe there's a connection there, or let's bring in some other concepts. But whatever it is, you're starting to make connections between these sort of larger concepts that come from your specific information. So this is the inductive process, about taking all this mess of specific data that you've gathered and coming up with more general ideas and connections between these general ideas. So then you want to corroborate anything that you find. So when you think there's maybe a relationship based on what you're finding, then you want to evaluate RPEs, which are rival plausible explanations, which basically is there another way to describe why I'm seeing this connection? And if you can evaluate those and say, no, well, there could be something else, but this seems to be the best explanation for what I'm seeing, then that means you're evaluating any other rival plausible explanations or alternative explanations for your findings and saying, no, what I'm finding seems more likely. And then you also want to corroborate using any disconfirming cases or evidence by saying, well, this doesn't fit with that. So how many of these exist, and can I explain those while still holding true to what I think is the original connection? And so basically you're trying to legitimize your original findings and your original connections. And then, of course, the last step is reporting those findings, because anytime you do research, you always want to report, you always want to disseminate somewhere. It might not be a peer-reviewed journal, although that's kind of the top of where you want to start. But I mean, putting this somewhere where people are going to see it and get that information. And there is special software that helps to organize and analyze this data. So there are some computer-assisted analyses. In Vivo is a really good one that's used for qualitative data, but there are others. Basically it'll try to look for word patterns. So, key terms that are used a lot, and it'll sort of try to analyze things like that. It still requires a lot of, the individual researcher poring through the information, but it kind of helps. So then when you're authenticating your conclusions, basically this is where there's no set standards for evaluating validity or authenticity in terms of, are you finding something that's actually indicative of the real world for whatever group or thing you're trying to explain? And there isn't, like when you're looking at quantitative, statistics and things like that, we have statistical significance, we have things like that. You don't have that in qualitative research like this because there are no numbers. And so there's no real, let's evaluate the validity. But you can assess individual pieces of information. So you can look and say, well, how credible was the informant? Do I think that they're, telling me the truth? Do do they have any reason to lie to me about this? Do they have any reason to hide things or to alter the truth? So that credibility is something you can sort of on a case-by-case basis. How credible do you think this information is? Especially if you have, a major disconfirming case and you can say, well, that person really, I think they weren't really credible. I think they thought I was going to use this information. They were paranoid. I was going to use this information and give this to the police or something like that, turn them in for whatever they say. So I don't think they were being honest with me. And maybe that's why they don't fit with everybody else. That is sort of how you can use that idea of credibility. You can also ask if statements were made in response to your questions as the researcher or if they were spontaneous. Because just because somebody's answering your question doesn't mean that it's not valid. But if they suddenly want to tell you about something and you didn't even ask about it, then that's probably something that's really important to them. They want to make sure that you know that. So that's probably something you want to make sure you include in some way in when you're doing your analyses and your write-up of your information. And then you also want to ask whether the presence or absence of the researcher influences any statements that were made or any actions that were observed. So does your presence change how they were behaving? So you're essentially assessing how much reactive effects you think exist. And so were people behaving differently because you were observing them? Or do you think you pretty much you had enough rapport, or you think that you were doing covert research and so you think that they didn't know you were a researcher, so you don't think there were reactive effects? However you can sort of assess your own situation, you need to know and sort of evaluate whether you think your presence affected the research or not. And if you can sort of address all of these things, that's kind of the best way to authenticate your final conclusions, to say, here's why these relationships exist, and here is why I can say with confidence, or at least with some confidence, that I think these are real, and this is something that it really exists, and it's not just something that I observed because of my position or because of what I was seeing. But it's actually indicative of what happens in the real world, and that's kind of how you authenticate your conclusions.